Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this very special Travel Weekly webinar on the important topic of mental health. Now, when we launched our focus on mental health in travel, Mental Health Matters, last year, we could never have known that a global pandemic was going to sweep across the world, nor the scale of the impact that it would have on our sector or the people working within it. The effect has been devastating, and it's putting enormous strain on businesses and individuals, with countless reports of stress and anxiety and depression emerging, not to mention grief for people who have lost loved ones and colleagues to the disease. Only last week, I spoke to a travel agent on one of our Travel Weekly webcasts who broke down in tears as she described her fight to save the business that she had spent 20 years building. And I also spotted some truly disturbing posts on social media from another agent who, when I called him, described he was in such financial turmoil that he just could not see a light at the end of the tunnel. Now, as part of our Mental Health Matters series, we were always planning to run one of our Travel Weekly business breakfasts this month in partnership with our friends at Deloitte and the Mental Health Foundation, which has been a guiding light in all of our activity into this very important issue. Now, of course, we can't hold that event in person due to COVID restrictions and advice around social distancing, so we are running it virtually today instead. And I'm delighted that Deloitte is still partnering with us in today's webinar, which will involve a keynote presentation from special guest John Binns, brought to us courtesy of Deloitte, followed by a discussion moderated by my colleague, Travolution editor Lee Hayhurst, with speakers Chris O'Sullivan from the Mental Health Foundation, Belinda Vazquez from TUI, and Karen Morris from Travel Counsellors. Now, like you, I'm really looking forward to the session, but first I'd like to introduce Alistair Pritchard, who is lead partner for travel and aviation at Deloitte, to tell us a little more about today's keynote speaker and to formally introduce today's topical and never more important session. So welcome to you, Alistair.
Thanks very much, Lucy, and hi everybody. It's great to see or to be able to speak to so many of you again after such a difficult 6-month period. This is something, as Lucy said, that we've been talking to Lucy and Travel Weekly about for some time. The mental health area has been an extremely important theme and topic for me personally for many, many years, and for Deloitte. And therefore, we're really pleased to be working with Lucy on this. I'm a mental health champion within Deloitte, and it's an area we've invested very heavily in for way more than 10 years. And the driver behind that has been John Binns, who has led that transformation within our organisation around how we look at and to treat and deal with mental health within the firm. Over that time, and he's become so recognised in what he does that he's started to do that over the last number of years for other companies and helping advise them on how they think about mental health and how we support people. So I'm so delighted that John's been able to join us today. I couldn't think of a better time to do this. And so with that, I really hope you enjoy today's session, which I hope you find useful and valuable at this difficult time. Thanks, Lucy.
So thank you, Lucy and Alistair, for that introduction. It's my job now to introduce our first speaker. As Alistair said, we've got John Binns from Deloitte, who's going to go through some thoughts about mental health from his perspective and his expertise, and then we'll get into the panel discussion after that. So over to John. Can I introduce you, and we'll speak to the panel afterwards. Thank you.
So thank you all for inviting me this morning. It's really great to be here. And of course, there's never been a more important time, I think, to be talking about mental health for all of us during the crisis that we're in at the moment, but, you know, particularly for you guys within the industry that you're all working in. A really, really difficult time and an absolutely critical time for us all just to think about how perhaps looking after our own mental health and the mental health of those around us is something that we should really focus on. Perhaps I'll start by just telling you a little bit about, you know, why I'm interested in mental health and, you know, why I think I may have something to say on the subject. I'm a former Deloitte partner. I'm actually vice chair of Mind now nationally, and I've been on the board of Mind for the last 9 years. And my interest in mental health came out of my own personal experience whilst a partner in a very pressurized world that you will all be familiar with, finding myself in a place on an evening I'll always remember, actually, one Tuesday evening back in 2008 it was, sitting in front of my computer at the kitchen table where I would often do some work, and realizing that I had to send an email in to, for me, with the 3 key partners in my part of the business, to say that I simply couldn't face coming into work the next morning. And I can remember agonizing about how I would phrase that, what words I might use, what I might say. That evening going on and getting tighter and tighter and tighter, and finally pressing the button on that email about midnight. And from that night, I didn't go into work for 3.5 months. I was off sick for 3.5 months. And if you'd have talked to me in the middle of that period, my thoughts were that there was just no way I would ever be able to go back and thrive and survive and be happy in a kind of pressurized world that you will all kind of recognize. But those thoughts weren't actually true, actually. And after that time off, I didn't pick up all my responsibilities immediately, but after a couple of months I did, and I was back out there in the market, subject to the same kind of pressures that I've previously been subject to. I think I probably can say that I was commercially successful in the sort of 7 or 8 years after that breakdown, for want of a better word. Probably as commercially successful as I had been for the 7 or 8 years as a partner before. More importantly, I was happier as a partner in that business for the 7 or 8 years after that breakdown, principally because some of the things that I learned from getting into that very dark place where I just didn't recognize myself. My ability to make decisions seemed to have deserted me. My level of anxiety about things I wouldn't normally worry about had gone through the roof. My ability to kind of focus and stay in the moment. If you were talking to me in the room, my thoughts would keep flying elsewhere. Actually, those thoughts that I wouldn't be able to go back and do what I'd done before weren't true. And it's something I'm going to come back to, the truth that actually thoughts are just thoughts and thoughts are not facts. It's something that I'm going to move on to when I start to take you through just some top tips, which I think might be helpful for all of us in this current environment, just to make sure that we understand that whilst we can't necessarily make the bad stuff in the world around us go away, we can't, just I wish I could, but we can't. But we can just make sure by the way we're thinking about things or behaving isn't adding to the situation and actually could perhaps mitigate the impact that it has on us. And you'll see as I go through those tips, for which there will be some slides, that there's a strong element of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, principle underpinning it. CBT was something that was really important to me in putting myself back together when I was in a bad way. But I became the first mental health champion back in 2010 in Deloitte, making myself available for people to come and talk should they have an issue they were worrying about. There's something like 45 of those now across the Deloitte business. And I recognized back in 2014 that I probably needed an academic understanding of CBT as well as a personal one if I was going to take some of my work forward. So you'll see some principles of CBT underpinning some of the things I'm going to share with you. And the important thought there is you don't need to be anywhere near ill for some of those principles just to be helpful around ensuring that we all perhaps are able to do some stuff to keep us more of the time enthused, engaged, up for stuff when we're isolated or when we're under pressure. So I'm going to swap now to share the slides with you. The first slide, and something that I learnt and see time and time again in the one-to-one sessions that I now have with people, is a truth that when we're under pressure, and particularly when we're isolated, it's important to remember a couple of things. And one is to recognize that the more time we allow ourselves in an uncertain environment where, particularly in your industry, the world is changing, you don't know what quite to expect, the more we allow our thoughts to spend too much time in the future, then that brings with it a high risk of anxiety. Why is that? Because the more we project out to the future and try to project what might happen in next year, this and this and this and this, then the more variables that come into play, and the more difficult it is to actually picture that future. So one thought that I want you to start to play with is understanding too much time allowing our thoughts to dwell in the future brings with it a risk of anxiety. Conversely, too much time in the past brings with it a risk of low mood. Typically, words come into your head like, oh, if only I hadn't done that. Why did that have to happen? If that person hadn't done that, or if this hadn't happened, then it would have been. What if only? Very, very negative words, and thoughts, which can lead to low mood and in serious cases, depression. So what should we be trying to do, and what should we be trying to do particularly now in the situation we're in? Actually think of ways to bring our minds more to the present. And what does that involve? Typically, a couple of good words, for the moment, what is my plan? And when I say for the moment, I don't say we should become like goldfish, ever in a kind of total present. It is important to forward plan, but demarcate the time when you're going to forward plan. And when a thought comes into your mind, which might be a worrying thought about the future or this, capture that thought, make a note of it, and set a time when you're going to deal with it. Don't let speculation about the future infect every day of your life. So for the moment, what do I mean by that? Purposeful activity. What in the next 2 or 3 weeks are the key things that I'm going to be doing where I can influence the situation, where perhaps I can control things, and I will engage in that purposeful activity for the next, say, 2 or 3 weeks, and then we'll see. Then I'll have a review. So just from this morning, start to think about that concept. Beware of too much time in the future, risk of anxiety, too much time in the past, risk of low mood, purposeful activity in the present, and a little plan for what you might be doing for the next 2 or 3 weeks, quite a firm basis on which to build. Now, I'm often asked when I do talks, how can I recognize if something's going wrong with me or perhaps colleagues? And I just wanted to share with you a slide here, which sets out what are actually a very well-trodden path of symptoms to look out for in ourselves and others. One of the key empowering things that I want to share with you is that if you take a little bit of time to, or are kind enough to yourself, perhaps, to ask yourself some questions around these bullet points on this slide, and understand that very often, if I do that and I notice some stuff and I make 1 or 2 small changes, it will make quite a big difference to the way I feel. So I think there is an uplifting part of what I'm going to say, which is, small changes make big differences to the way I feel. But very often we don't even give ourselves the time to ask ourselves questions around, for instance, that list. I didn't. If I'd have just kind of known that, just a little bit of learning that I should look out for that kind of thing, maybe that would have been at least 1 brick in the wall of stopping me getting to the place that I got into. Now, when I say that's kind of well known, I mean, it is pretty well known. If you're in front of a GP and that GP is worrying that you might be being impacted by pressure in the environment around you so that you're beginning to develop a stress reaction to it, they will have that list on their knee when they're asking you questions. So just knowing those things is important in itself. But it isn't quite as easy as that because, of course, we're all different people and we all don't start from the same base. For instance, some of us tend to move to decisions more quickly. So we will, on a smaller amount of evidence, move on. Others are more reflective. Neither is right or wrong, it's just different. Some of us are more introvert, some of us are more extrovert. Again, not right, not wrong, just different. So what we're looking for here is changes in ourselves and others along these bullets. The person who used to be, typically would be the person in the meeting who says, okay, that's enough, let's move on, who now seems more hesitant. Or the person who would typically organize, the project breakfast or the team get together, whether it be on Zoom or physically, who now not only doesn't organize it, but doesn't turn up to it. It's changes in these things that we need to account for in ourselves and others. Now, one of the things that I said earlier, which I think is really important, I talked about my thought that I wouldn't ever get back to doing what I'd done before, is to recognize this truth, that thoughts are just thoughts, thoughts are not facts. When we're isolated or we are under pressure and becoming anxious about things, we tend to forget that that is true. And we tend to give thoughts a greater weight than they deserve. And so just again, understanding that truth, that thought that I'll never work again, or this person will, very often is only one particular slice of the truth and might not even be true at all. And people can get very good at, and we can all get good at just learning to give thoughts proportion. A good prompt is, is that thought really true? Is it really helpful? Is it really logical? Are there not 3 other outcomes from that thing that I'm worrying about? That thought that just went into my head didn't go anywhere near. I'm going to write them down. What are they? But you know what? The biggest and best way of giving thoughts proportion is talking to someone else. Nearly always, when you talk to someone else, and take the risk of being a little bit more open with a colleague or someone around you about what you're worrying about, they would start doing natural CBT without knowing they're doing it. Are you sure? Oh, hang on a second, but there's 2 or 3 other things that might happen here. It's not absolutely bound to be that way. So understanding that truth, thoughts are just thoughts and thoughts are not facts, is again something I'd leave you with this morning. And I'm not going to, I'm afraid, in this session, when I do longer form session, unpack all those thought distortions, as they're called, typical ways of thinking that we can all get into when we're under pressure. I'll maybe just pick out one, which is the bottom one there, which is beware musts and absolutes. Psychologists have shown time and time again that when we're under pressure, all of us, we tend to expand the number of things in the world that we tell ourselves have to happen or must happen. That person can't behave like that. That must be done exactly like this at 9:01 in exactly that way. When the truth is actually that very often those rigid demands, things we tell ourselves have to be, are not actually quite as true as that thought tells us. And this was perhaps one of the most important understandings that I had that helped me survive and thrive after that breakdown. Being introduced to this concept, beware unrealistic, rigid demands. Look out for those words, must, can't, have to. They're red flag words. And I realized that as a Deloitte partner, if you'd have asked me in 2010 to write down all the things you need to do, you must do to be a successful Deloitte partner, I'd still be writing them down now. I can promise you, must always say yes to this type of way. Always go to that meeting, say no to this, dress in a particular way, perhaps behave. I reckoned on reflection, I was probably, adding something like 20 to 25% additional pressure to that which the world had kindly created for me by the number of things I was telling myself I must do. So just be careful with those words and listen out for teams using those words. It's often a sign that the team is beginning to creep when you hear them constantly, must, has to, can't, this has to. Can actually be a sign that they're losing proportion. The last slide I'm going to share with you is just something that's come out of when I bring groups of mental health champions together in the Deloitte business, but since 2014, when I've essentially been doing this working for myself, I have also bring together groups of mental health champions in other businesses. And when I ask them, what tends to be going on when people are coming to see you and they're starting to, then that's where this 4-pillar model comes from. And if I make perhaps 3 observations to finish on it, we will hopefully bring it to life. The first is that the ingredients that any of us have in those 4 pillars will make a difference to the way we feel. Call it our mental health, our happiness, our engagement for life. It really doesn't matter which. The ingredients that we put in there or are in there will make a difference. Point 2 is we don't have absolute control over the ingredients that go in those columns. We don't, and particularly in the world that we're in now, we don't have absolute control. But the truth is, and it's a really important truth to remember now, is that although we can't control absolutely the things that go in those columns, we nearly always have a greater ability to make choices or influence the ingredients that we put in those columns than our thoughts will tell us. Going back to thoughts are just thoughts, thoughts are not facts. And our thoughts might tell us, for instance, oh, in the work column, well, I have to say yes to this role. I can't say no to that. I have to do this, or the consequences will be terrible. People will think X, people will think Y. When actually the truth is that we very often can make more decisions in that column, and the consequences won't be as dramatic as perhaps our thoughts tell us. And perhaps in the nutrition and exercise column, we might well think, there's just no point to doing it. I've got to do this. I can't go out to the gym. I can't do this. I can't because of the situation. Well, the truth is it is much more difficult to do some of the things that many of us have done before, but it is actually possible to achieve some of the same outcomes by doing things in a different way. So second observation, can't absolutely control what goes in those ingredients, but very typically can make more changes or influence the choices than we think. And the final observation is any one of us who absolutely over-focuses on one of those or 2 of those at the expense of the others will run the risk of making ourselves fragile. And why is that? Well, if you think about it, it doesn't need to be the work column. If you think about the home column, you will know people who, if I say, I must be the perfect mother or I must be the perfect father, you will know people who are very invested in that perception of themselves. And just think how much more impacted emotionally they are when their child doesn't do well at A-levels or something happens at university. Far more than someone who has a sense of themselves or has invested in creating a sense of themselves across all 4 of those columns. So you will perhaps know some people who, actually do seem to focus almost entirely on one column and they seem to be very successful and happy. And it can happen, but it's, I can tell you, extraordinarily high risk. And I would encourage everybody to think about, even in the current situation, what is their little plan of purposeful activity in each of those columns? And to finish on that kind of hopefully, optimistic point, if you then take a bit of time to just monitor yourself a bit and those around you, using perhaps that symptoms slide that I put up, just, am I feeling a bit like this? Is this happening? And then standing back when you perhaps have done that and say, you know what, small changes in the things I do are going to make a big difference to the way I feel. Maybe put that 4-pillar plan up in front of you and just ask yourself, are there some things that I could just dial down a little, just dial down and up, drop that one, do a little bit more of that? You'll probably find that the answer is yes, actually. And if you do so, you will probably find that the impact on the way you feel will be changed really quite significantly. So I'm going to finish there, and thank you for listening.
Thanks very much for that insight. And actually, it was really nice to start on a sort of personal story, John, because I think as part of what Travel Weekly's been doing throughout last year was to bring to the fore those personal stories in our mental health matters. A series of focuses, which is, like I said, culminated at the Globes in January, where we had Mental Health Foundation, and I'll bring Chris in now to talk about the work we've been doing with you. So we had you as our designated charity in January, and again we had those stories on screen in front of 1,200 or so of industry professionals and brave people prepared to go out there and tell us their stories. So Chris, just a few thoughts from what you've heard from John about that need and that requirement to sort of share actually and tell people their stories and to make it personal and real.
Yes, I think it's well known from the research and now from a couple of decades of work on stigma in the UK and in other places, that hearing personal testimony and social contact is the thing that makes the big difference. And it's always amazing when people are prepared to share their stories. And I think it's very important that people hear not just stories of mental ill health and not just stories of recovery, as in it got a bit difficult and it all got better, that they hear the whole broad spectrum of mental health experiences. And one of the things we found working with business, and I'm sure John feels the same, is that some of the times where it's most effective is where you have a whole mixture of stories and a very broad range of people sharing. So you have the person who says, I have a super commute, and if I don't take my Friday at home, I don't work effectively. And if I spend too much time on my emails on the train, then I'm stressed. And you have the person who says, I struggled with an eating disorder in my teens, and it's still an issue for me that I have to attend to every day. And that story is part of the spectrum. I also think, though, that we have to be careful in over encouraging people to share stories. Disclosure is a very uniquely personal thing, and not everybody who has an experience of a mental health problem needs to disclose or should disclose. I think we've seen during the pandemic much more permission to share and much more sharing. And as the boundaries for many people between work and home, or the ability to hide distress and the inability to do so because it comes bubbling out, have blurred, there's a lot more people who are sharing a lot more. And as we go back to working in whichever way we work, those disclosures can't be put back in the box. So I'm hoping that the culture of sharing and being more aware of our colleagues' personal lives will lead to an environment where mental health and well-being check-ins and other things that are cultural carrying on, and this being a real herald for cultural change in relation to mental health in workplaces.
Yeah. Just before we go on to the others, John started off by talking about future, past, present, and I guess for businesses and especially business owners actually who are trying to deal with what's gone on in the last 6 months, the future is very important, and they are focused on the future almost inevitably because they want to know what's going on with their business, whether it's got a future and whether they can carry on employing people. So it's very hard for business owners in particular, people who are actually responsible, to not focus on the future because it's so critical to them. So how do you advise people to obviously keep their eye on the future, but try and live in that present?
I think it's very, very important that leaders recognize the need to look after their own mental health. Oftentimes people in passion-driven businesses and passion-driven sectors, and travel is a passion-driven sector, and people outside travel wouldn't necessarily know this, but we know from some of the stories that Travel Weekly has shared that people pour their last ounce of heart and soul into their business, whether it's big or small, for the good of the client and the service that they provide. And we see exactly the same thing in health services, in public services, in all sorts of areas, where people put the last ounce of energy into the client or the purpose or the business, and they leave nothing for themselves. And I'm not normally a fan of the fit your own oxygen mask before helping others, but it is a uniquely travel reference. I tend to go for the you can't serve from an empty vessel. And one of the things I would say is that John's advice on focusing on the present and not necessarily dwelling on the future and the past is very important for personal life. And if you can, as a leader, do that, it will enable you to have greater clarity on the decisions you need to make on the direction of your business. And it's not for everyone, but mindfulness meditation is something which has a really strong evidence base for helping people to stay in the moment. And so mindfulness is paying deliberate attention to what is happening as it's happening. And practicing mindfulness isn't about forgetting what has happened in the past or not thinking about what's happening in the future. It's about creating a space in time to step out of those obligations and return to the present, which enables you then to focus better on the decisions that you may have to have. And the risk at the moment, in particular with overwhelm and challenge, is that people burn out. And we know that that burned out leaders make less effective decisions in the long run, and that sometimes even in periods of challenge there needs to be a moment carved off for those people making decisions to sit back, reflect, recalibrate and recover themselves so that they can make the best decisions they can about their businesses and on behalf of the people in those businesses.
John, just before we move on, a few of the further thoughts from you. I mean, a big part of your mental health is the feeling that you can affect things, that you have agency on the outcome. And actually in travel at the minute, it's very difficult for travel companies, particularly leaders in travel companies looking to the future, to feel as though they've got any ability to actually affect that future. A lot of their decisions are out their hands, just cannot know what's going to happen. And that can feed into a sense of helplessness, I guess.
Yeah, I mean,
how do you attack that, John, when you really need to feel you can affect the future? I guess, is it focus on that, what you can do today, and hope the future takes care of itself?
Well, I think, I mean, there's two comments I'd make on that. I mean, one is, absolutely building on what Chris was saying. I think it's important to recognise that, I'm not in any way saying that future planning is not something a business needs to engage in or an individual needs to get. It clearly does. What I'm asking, and through that kind of slide, as it were, thought, is to recognise that needs to be kind of demarcated. That the problem is when the constantly dwelling on the future infects every day of what you're doing, and it can lead to a kind of paralysis. So what I'm saying is, do capture the thoughts and the worries about the future, but set a time when you're going to do forward planning, strategic review, and then for the rest of the time you are then focusing on what things you might be able to control or influence, and to accept some of the things that you can't. And it's not easy, but actually the more you engage in purposeful activity around the things that you can control or the things that you can influence, the more you will keep your kind of mind focused, and you will help yourself be distracted from anxiety building thoughts around the future. So it's about demarcation, not about not doing future planning. It's recognizing it needs to be put in a box and decided when you're going to do it, and then focusing on the purposeful activity in the meantime.
Okay, let's bring in Karen now from Travel Counsellors. You've been listening to what's been said, and I'm sure with great interest and nodding away there. And actually, Travel Counsellors has just released some new mental health initiative, hasn't they? And it chimes a lot with what John was saying. Just explain what you've been doing, Karen, in the business to make sure you're looking at your employees' mental health and the management as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've not heard that saying before, John. Thoughts are just thoughts and thoughts are not facts. So that's something that I've definitely made a note of. I love that. I agree with everything that John has said about ensuring that you focus on the things that you can control and don't worry about the things that you can't control. And let's be honest, we're in a situation where we just can't control what's going to happen in the future. So we have had a real focus on ensuring that we have enhanced the level of support that we provide for our TC community. That's our travel counsellors, but it's also our colleagues that are in the support hub. So this week we have launched a new wellbeing hub, and we've had lots of activity around that. We've actually partnered with a company called Able Futures to enhance the level of support that we offer. We already have access to a personal counsellor, and we've had her working within the business for the last 10 years, but we just felt under the current climate it was so important that we enhance the level of support that we offer. So this week we've had a particular focus on a different subject matter every day leading up to Mental Health Awareness Day on Saturday. So we focused on things like fitness and health. We focused on financial well-being. We're going to do an interview on talking to our personal counsellor to just get her view on how important it is to look after yourself. that's one of the things that I have learned maybe over the last couple of years about being a leader in business. I didn't always look after myself first. So that's something that I've definitely embraced, because if I'm not okay, the chances are people around me are not going to be okay, because they look up to you, don't they, in a business. So yeah, we've done lots of things. Our travel counsellors in particular have come together as a community, and the level of support that they have created amongst the community is just unbelievable. They have set up Facebook pages called TC Rate My Plate, so that's all about food. They've set up Facebook pages about financial support. They have just been absolutely unbelievable. So I guess for us, it was probably a bit easier for us because we were already had a community of remote workers, and communication has always been key for us. So we've just upped our level of communication to ensure that everybody's still engaged. We look out for red flags, just to make sure that we are, looking out for those people that we think, like John said, all of a sudden they've gone quiet on you, but normally they would be the person that comes to you on a day-to-day basis. So we've got lots and lots of things going on.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Karen, because in our round table and actually throughout the Mental Health Matters focus, we picked out home working as being one of the issues we should look at, not realizing at the time that we'd all be home workers within 6 months. So you've got a real advantage there as travel counsellors, that you've been doing this for as long as travel counsellors has existed. So it's really good learnings there.
It's so true that, because when we went into lockdown and I was forced to work from home. I think I was the last man standing in the Venus building here. So when I first went home, I've got to be honest, I struggled for 2 or 3 weeks because I couldn't get my head around the fact that I couldn't just turn to somebody and have a conversation. So if we were working on a project and we had to move things along, you had to have a meeting and a Zoom call. And so I found it really difficult. But what it has done is given me a better appreciation of what it's like for one of our travel counsellors working from home. Yeah. So I just think it's brought us together and as a community, both from a support aspect, but also from a travel counsellor aspect as well. So I know how frustrated our travel counsellors must be when they send an email and nobody responds for 4 hours because they have no idea what that person is involved in. And that was my biggest frustration working from home. So, yeah, I think we've definitely come together more as a stronger community because we've got more of an understanding of what it's like working from home.
Yeah. Chris, you wanted to say something. I'll bring in Belinda next when but you put your hand up to say something. So you wanted a thought on that, Chris?
I didn't consciously put up my hand, but what I would say, Karen, is that it's nice to see you in the office. I remember you describing your office before, and I can see out of the window that you're in. I think it's hearing that for travel counsellors in the business from you will be very strong and very validating. And one of the things we were saying earlier on about sharing stories, I think authentic leadership is very, very important at a time like this, where leaders in the business have a stake and talk about that and talk about feelings and open up a bit more. It's another one of those things that helps the culture to change. And the programme sounds great, Karen, and exactly the right timing for it too.
Listen, I couldn't agree more. Again, something else that I've learned over the years as a leader is sometimes it's good to show your vulnerability, because I think people resonate with you a lot more by being, showing that. So yeah, it's so important. That level of communication and being honest and sharing with people is just so important.
Belinda, welcome. Huge disruption to TUI. TUI is such a massive business. I mean, travel counsellors is a big business. TUI's got so much going on with retail and airlines and all this stuff. I mean, the disruption must have been immense. And I guess the danger is that this kind of thing isn't prioritised. But let us know what you've been doing at TUI to try to make sure that all your staff have been looked after in what's been a very difficult period.
Yeah, I totally echo what Karen says there, in that we've got a extremely good wellbeing hub, and we have always directed and communicated to teams where to find all the hints, the tips, and the really valuable health that a lot of people need. I think when this all first happened and we went into lockdown, we didn't have a home working division, and working from home was a kind of once a week, maybe once a fortnight occasion. So when you suddenly go with, you know, from my area, retail, you've got 4,000 people that suddenly stop dead. And that in itself was a massive challenge. And what I've learned is that everyone is unique. Stopping dead, not having a routine, not having any work to do, and then seeing the outpouring on social media about how people's holidays have been disrupted, they want refunds, etc., really impacted colleagues across the whole business. The thing that I have learned, and when I look back on it, is actually what we are doing for working people versus what we are doing for furlough people can be very different. And I have consciously thought about those two different sets of people in very different ways. When you're working, at the initial 3-4 weeks, you were working at 150 miles an hour. Your work life impacted in your personal life, whether that meant you were sat at the kitchen table and your laptop was open for 15, 16 hours a day, whether that meant you were trying to homeschool your children at the same time as working a 10, 12-hour day on highly pressurized calls. You know, those people who were working had very unique issues and really needed a lot of different help. And then you come to the guys that were furloughed, and for me, you know, I was furloughed as well. I've spent 22 years working, and to suddenly be furloughed and have no purpose, or at least that's how I felt, and to become a full-time teacher to my 10-year-old and 9-year-old, I mean, they were glad to be going back to school. How I coped during that time wasn't brilliant. Those first 3 or 4 weeks in trying to understand and trying not to worry and talking about that future piece, you know, trying not to worry about whether I'm going to have a job, whether Tui's going to still be here, whether my family are safe, when can the grandparents come and see their grandchildren, you know, all those worries escalate in your head. And absolutely, you realise, whether it's through default or purposefully, that actually the here and now is what counts, and getting through each day. So when I came back to work at the start of June, what I'd learned in that period is communication is absolutely king. And the consistency with which you get those messages out there is really king as well. So when we're making really difficult decisions and then having to communicate that out, I've actually had to really think about what I'm saying. And the reason I really emphasize that is because you shouldn't just be talking to people about what you think they want to hear. You need to step back and think about actually what should they be hearing. Because when I had to make the closure announcements, you know, I was focusing a lot on the rationale. Why are we doing it? Why do we need to do it? What's the process we go through now? But actually talking to someone that doesn't work in the travel industry, actually what was more important was, what help can we offer you now? What support is there that we can help you through this period? And actually I changed my whole script and how I announced that to our teams based on the fact that actually that was more important at that time, and therefore then pointing them in the direction of the support and the help, which isn't just a phone number, is a whole host and a whole raft of support. So I've learned a lot. Absolutely.
Yeah, one of the things that came out of the round table earlier last year was, you know, it's not just people who are in work, it's when you lose work and you've been involved in this community, and travel is one of the, it's all businesses are a community, I'm sure, but travel seems to have that real community sense about it. And you suddenly stop getting invited to things, you're suddenly not in that realm anymore. Karen, I mean, I know you're like Tui, you've had to look at your workforce and you've gone through some difficult decisions there. So how are you trying to help those people who unfortunately won't be with you any longer and are looking for what's next?
Yeah, I think when we first went into lockdown and we were able to take use of the furlough scheme, I remember, you know, some of the team who, like Belinda says, were working 12, 13-hour days. I remember thinking, you know, I don't know if you remember, but the weather was really, really nice when we first went into lockdown. So you were seeing things on Facebook where people were out in the gardens, relaxing, you know, doing really what they saw was really nice things. And then, you know, I felt for the team that were under so much pressure because they were working really hard, but we had to do that to survive. It was as simple as that. So now that we're getting to the point whereby, unfortunately, we are going to be making people redundant. When we've been going through the consultation process, one of the key things that we've communicated is what we're going through now is nobody's fault. So regardless of whether you've been on furlough or working in the business, it's nobody's fault. And we've got to, you know, we did what we needed to do at the time to make sure that we survived this and we came out the other end. But equally, it's so important that those people that are facing redundancy feel that they are being dealt with care, with empathy. So we have put, you know, a support package in place, regardless of whether you're going to be leaving us or you're going to be staying. And that includes things like, you know, some of these people may have worked for us for 15 years and they've probably never even gone for an interview. So it's so important that we support them, not just the here and now, but support them for the next 6 months as well, because it might be 6 months for some of these people to find another job, especially if they want to stay in travel. So we've extended, for example, the very early on, we created a welfare fund, and that was a hardship fund that was available to our travel counsellors and to our colleagues as well. So we've made that available for up to 6 months after a colleague may leave the business. We've put a support package in place in terms of health and well-being. If they were part of the private health scheme through Bupa, we've extended that for 6 months, because it's so important to us that when people leave the business, that they still feel that they're being cared for. We don't want anybody leaving and then feeling that they're out there on their own in this big world. We want to make sure that we do follow-ups with them as well, because we do care about people, but it's just what we're having to do is not nice and it's nobody's fault, and we've got to keep remembering that.
John, I'm sure you can empathise with that feeling of, if you're made redundant, you feel it's your fault and you'll never get another job again, and you forget the values and the skills and the things you can bring to future employers. So I guess that's what your message would be, is the focus on those things. And again, like Karen said, people who are made redundant now, it's just simply not their fault. It's to do with their abilities.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, you raise a really good point, that often, you know, people get into a difficult place. It's because they sometimes have the traits that make them really good at their job, and probably attracted them to want to work with you in the first place. And you mentioned sort of like take responsibility for things, care about the outcome of stuff, can become a bit disproportionate if we're not careful when things start going away. And those good things just become a little brackets too much. So it's all my fault, and it's all done. And, you know, so therefore that kind of communication you were talking about that, Karen, I think is absolutely vital to help people understand that, you know, it's not all their, you know, it's not their fault, it's not their responsibility. And so really, really, really good to see that, because it is absolutely a destabilizing thought. It's all down to me. It's all my fault. I should have done things differently.
I guess there's also a possibility that people who keep their jobs feel guilty. Well, why is it me that's kept my jobs and all my friends and colleagues have gone? So it's a really difficult one. Can I talk to Belinda? Belinda, about really those you mentioned those agents, of which you employ many, and unfortunately some of the stores, you know, are going to be closing. So that for them, that's not going to be, you know, their future work. You're going to have to downsize your staff on that level. But for those agents, they are used to dealing with people face to face, and suddenly, like you said, that's stopped overnight almost. That's part of their mental health, is that these people. How have you tried to sort of help them replicate that? Because actually, I suppose they've gone working from home. If they're still working, they're dealing with more complaints than the nice parts of the job, which is selling people their dreams and their holidays. Really tough to complete flip, isn't it? So how have you managed to support those guys through what transition?
Well, what we actually did, so we built up a temporary contact centre, everyone working from home. There was about 1,500 people almost overnight, which, like you say, dealing with the negative all the time. We actually changed our structure a little bit, and we put nearly 50 support managers in place. So these support managers normally would be store managers who are there to run sort of a little virtual team. So what we tried to do was create a little community within that virtual world. But what was really key is that you had some downtime as a team. So you had that banter, you had that release, you had that chance to vent. You also did something fun, even if it was just 15 minutes, half an hour, just to take that break, because it was so important. If you're on those phones for 8-10 hours a day, constantly taking a negative call after a negative call after a negative call, you do start to take it personally, and you do start to get really, really down about the situation we find ourselves in. So just having those support managers in place, managing sort of teams of 10-20 people, and having the downtime and creating those little mini teams was really important. And we've actually kept that through into our home working division, because we recognise that although you are one clump of people, it's really important to have that team spirit and that banter. You know, me working at home, I'm someone who's hugely sociable, and I really like to know how your weekend was and how your evening was and how your aunt's cat is, and you know, all the lovely things that you get to talk to people about on a day-to-day basis. And the danger of being on those calls constantly is that is the bit that's missing, the bit that you talk about life, you know, a life outside work. You like to talk to people about that, and that's the bit that everyone was really missing. So it's important to take that time out to talk about those things and to chat about those things and to have a little bit of fun and add a little bit of laughter into a very doom and gloom situation. So we've kept that through in our home working division as well.
In our roundtable last year, we had Chris Nouts as a sort of specialist, but also a travel person speak. He's the guy who founded Culture Trip, and he's also a former psychiatrist. So he's got you can see both sides, and he spoke a lot about you know, the signs that you need to pick up on that someone's not coping. And obviously, it's much easier to do that in the office as they walk past your door. Maybe it's much more difficult doing it on Zoom calls or something like that. But there were a number of things that you could look out for. I wonder, what kind of things do you think you know either should raise a red flag, or equally you look at someone and say, oh, they're really coping well with lockdown? Because I think that people go both ways. You've seen a lot of celebrities, they've lost a load of weight, they've obviously gone off and done a lot of exercise. You think that's a good thing, but then I think there's people who've gone the opposite way as well. So what are you looking out for to make sure people
So over the last 2 months, for me, someone who is overly coping, someone whose life is perfect, is a real red flag, because I don't think you can get such a thing in today's world. I think also those people who are very quiet. Now, you can't misinterpret quiet. You know, some people are naturally quiet, but if there isn't a lot coming from them, you know, a little bit like when you're in an accident, you know, it's not necessarily the person who's shouting the loudest you go to first. So certainly the quiet, and certainly the looking perfect on the face of it. What I've introduced over the last 2 months, when, dare I say it, it's calming down just a little bit, is individual cuppers. So I have a cup of tea, and I get on a half an hour chat, a one-on-one. And I'm doing that at all levels, not just my direct reports, but from the team managers right down to the team advisors, because actually on a one-on-one, these people tend to open up a little bit more, and you can really gauge whether actually they need a little bit more support. You know, for me, I'm jumping in the car, I'm going to visit someone in a couple of weeks, and I'm going to take them to go to the local shop because actually they haven't been out for the last 6 months because of their concern. Now, I wouldn't have picked that up had I been in a team meeting or a group of 20 people having a good old chinwag. So having that one-to-one dedicated time with people, I think, is really important, even if it's just 15 minutes, once every 2 or 3 weeks.
Chris, do you have anything to add to that? Tips about what people can look at? I mean, Mental Health Week next week will raise this as a profile across the country, so there's likely to be more signs, emerging. And should you jump on everything you see, because maybe some people are coping, they're just doing well at hiding it, and they don't really want to have to talk about it. If they did, it could make matters worse. It's a very difficult one to address, especially over a Zoom call. Yeah,
it can be. I think Belinda's raised some brilliant points there, and it speaks to me as one of the things that we would say to all managers in sessions that we do is that knowing your people as people is critical for business success, but it's also critical for workplace mental health. And if you're a business which has a culture of workplace mental health programs, that's likely to be something you've already started to ingrain. But if you're a business that doesn't have it, then starting to do this now will make putting a mental health program in place an awful lot easier, because if you know your people as people, you can see when behavior changes, where you can see when things are going on, and you can notice that. And that's one of the biggest things to notice. I think Belinda, you went through some really great ideas there. I think having those one-to-ones is really useful, giving people a chance to have different kinds of voices in different kinds of forums. I think not everyone wants to come to a big Zoom wellbeing chat, and it's important. I think the biggest thing I would look out for is changes in behaviours, though, and you can also look at things like people who decide that they don't want to have their cameras on in calls, people who are less talkative than they have been before. And I would say generally there's never a reason not to ask someone how they are. And at the moment, in circumstances of greater risk to all of our mental health, when literally everybody has something to say about how they're feeling about what the latest news is on the pandemic, it's an excuse to make it business as usual to find out how people are doing. And it doesn't have to be depth and detail, but if you get used to a culture of saying how you're doing, it then allows you to move on to the next question, which is, I've noticed whatever you might have noticed, and I wondered if that was a sign that things weren't going so well. And then at that point, the things to remember are making sure that you're listening, making sure that you're not trying to solve people's problems. If they don't ask for you to solve them, they might just want to share them. Asking what you can do to help, and then making sure that you don't overpromise and underdeliver, because if someone discloses something to you, they really want to know that they've been heard. And one of the best ways to do that is to make sure that you carry through on the actions that you deliver, bearing in mind any policies you have in your business and your own personal boundaries. So, I mean, Belinda, it's great that you're going to visit somebody and to help them in that way, and that you're able to do that. But don't promise to do that if you can't do that, for example. So I think this is a real opportunity to bring everyday conversations about well-being into everyday business culture, so that when we do move, I'm not going to say move back, because we're not going to move back to where we were before. This is going to pattern our ways of working for the rest of most of our careers, and for the careers of everyone who's coming through. So when we move forward through the pandemic, if one of the legacies of the pandemic is that business A, cares more about mental health, and B, talks more about mental health, then it will be one small positive in a very, very difficult time.
Karen, I remember you telling us how you've been travel counsellors. How long now? Quite a number of years.
Yeah, so Travel Counsellors was started 26 years ago. Yeah. But I was only thinking the other day that I've actually, in January, I would have been in travel for 42 years. Wow. So yeah, I was one of the original people that started with Travel Counsellors when we set up 26 years ago.
So I remember you telling us, you've been the person in Travel Counsellors that people have come to their problems with. Yeah. And actually, and you become that person that they can offload on, and so on. but there was a sort of a chat on our round table about that, which is great, obviously, but who then looks after the people who are doing all the listening, because it can have an impact on your mental health that you're listening to all these stories, and there's clearly going to be a lot more coming up. So we must keep a focus on that somehow, to make sure that the people who look strong, who are the ones who have got all the answers or who are prepared to listen, are actually being looked after themselves. I remember you saying it did at one point come to a point where even you couldn't do any more than that, and you had to take some time out. So
yeah, no, that's really true. I guess we were quite lucky that we did quite a lot before all of this started, in terms of we've got, for example, 50 of our colleagues here in Venus that were trained up as mental health first aiders. And, so we have been really focused on making sure that we can identify when somebody's struggling. Now, like you say, it's easier if you're in the office environment. It's a little bit more difficult when people are working from home. However, the combination of us being honest and open and always talking about it's so important that you tell people how you're feeling, I think has really, really helped, again, our community coming together through various things we put in place, that, there's such a bond there where they genuinely want to help and support each other. And that is just, I think it's so powerful that we've got in excess of 2,000 travel counsellors around the world, that we're all looking out for each other. So, we've got now travel counsellors coming to us and saying, how are you? Are you okay? It must be horrendous what you're having to deal with, because you're having to make really difficult decisions about people's futures. So I just think there's just so much better level of understanding about what it's like. So everybody is on their own individual journey, but we're all having to deal with whatever we're dealing with to make sure that we get through it and we stay healthy and our families are healthy. So yeah, I just think the sense of community and the coming together is just absolutely, blown me away.
Actually, and John, we can't forget that actually the reason we're talking about this today is that we're in the middle of a global health pandemic and a global health crisis. So yes, obviously it's affecting everyone's businesses, but it's clearly affecting people in their private lives as well. And actually, for many people who are struggling in private lives, their work is the place where they can go to forget what's going on at home a little bit, and to do something they think's got more purpose, or got purpose, and they can just get on with life. So actually work can be a real benefit here, not the cause of your mental health problems.
No, absolutely. And in a sense, referring back to that kind of notion of a 4-pillar plan that I talked about, having something which is important to us, to you, as an individual, which exists in the work column, also exists in the home column, exists in the nutrition and exercise column, and also exists in the rest recovery column, is critical. And actually, work is not by any means the bad column at all. For many people, for a lot of us, it's something which is really integrally important to us. The key, though, is not to be just in any one of those columns, and to recognize that there are important things about ourselves which we value, which exist in the other 3 as well. Yeah. So work is engagement with work is really fantastic and important.
Well, we're nearly at the end of our time here, but we'll just wrap up with a few last thoughts about the industry itself. I mean, we're talking about mental health as regards our work life, but we work in the travel sector, and going on a holiday and travel is a massive part of everyone's mental health as well. So actually our product is part of this. So Belinda, I guess there's a really positive message out there on this industry, particularly when you want something to look forward to. I think that, when John talks about the future and obsessing on the future, actually in a positive way, when you obsess about a future, it's going to be positive and good. And one of those things could be looking forward to a holiday. That's a very good part of your mental health. So I guess it's important that the industry itself comes together and gets that message out there, because that is a message that has to get across. It may even change people's views on whether travel can start again, because it has such an impact.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the message I've been putting out to my teams is travel will absolutely come back. There is absolutely no way in this world travel won't come back, and we are ready and waiting for it when it does. You know, we talk about that past, future, present. You know, the present is really heartbreaking at the moment, you know, really heartbreaking. But actually, we know travel will come back, and we just have to bide our time until it does.
Yeah. Karen, you reflect that, I'm sure. I guess you'd rather be selling holidays, even though it's difficult at the minute, than selling, you know, some other products, insurance or something people don't really look forward to buying or spending the money on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for my own personal mental health, having 3 holidays a year and going to get sunshine is part of what keeps me going throughout the year. Yeah. So when we first went into lockdown, I was due to go on holiday, and that didn't happen. So the fact that I wasn't able then to go away until the summertime, it was really a real struggle for me. But I was lucky enough to have that 2-week holiday with my family, and that was so important. But yeah, I agree with Belinda. There's no doubt people are going to start traveling once you know, the confidence is there again, without doubt. I actually think if you talk to people, it's really top of their agenda, isn't it, to make sure that they have that time out, and holiday is definitely going to bounce back. We have to get through it and remain focused and just look forward to the future, because it's going to happen.
Yeah. Oh, the future.
We're all going to go back to working 15 hours a day again when it does bounce back.
The future is going to happen in some way, isn't it, Chris? You same with you. I mean, I guess as a mental health foundation, experiences, going and seeing new places, new people is I guess that's part of the stuff that you suggest people do if they're suffering at home.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, take a break is very much part of our 10 ways to wellbeing. And I think travel, as you've all said, travel will bounce back. It's very important to people. And all the way through the pandemic, we've been doing research projects tracking where people's mental health is and what's been happening with it. And we're just on World Mental Health Day, just for World Mental Health Day today, published some of the latest findings from this is the 7th wave of research, which started before lockdown. And we've been looking at resilience because it's easy to dwell on what's been difficult, but the research has been showing us that most people have found something which helps them to drag them through and to mitigate the effects of stress. And some of the things that were very popular were walking, visiting green spaces, getting outside their bubble, as well as that connection with family. And so, as I think John said, some of the things we have to do whilst things are restricted are different to the things that we'd ordinarily choose to do. So I guess the message from us would be, make sure you get outside, make sure you get your exercise, stay connected, and whilst you're outside, talk about where you might go when you can.
Yeah, just one last thought on what's coming up in the near future. It is obviously we've got Christmas. That's often a period associated with people having mental health issues, nothing to do with pandemics or anything, but it's how people get very pressured at Christmas time. And if this year we're restricted in terms of seeing our families and loved ones, that could be a problem. So just a quick thought on how firms can just make sure they've got a real sense of what's going on over that period.
Yes, I think plan it in now. We're certainly looking at the Christmas content that we'll be doing, and I think one of the things to bear in mind is that we often have one concept of what Christmas means for us, and then we become blinded or biased to what it might mean for other people. And within our firms, we'll have people who love Christmas and people who find Christmas difficult for all sorts of reasons. We'll have people who don't celebrate Christmas or who celebrate other festivals in other faiths at different times in the year. So it's about balance. But a lot of the world becomes obsessed with consumption and also on reviewing the year around that time. So I would expect it to be a challenge. I would expect any conversations on how Christmas is marked in terms of, not having traditional parties and all sorts of things. The photocopiers are safe this year, but have conversations about how you want to mark Christmas and how you want to remember 2020, and remember that this is going to have been a very challenging year, but it's also going to be a year when many people will have found ways to grow and develop, and there will be positives that need to be celebrated alongside the indisputable challenges and horrific experiences that many people have had.
Yeah, great. I do have to wrap things up, but I want just a quick last word to wrap things up to John, back to John, who started us off. You don't work in travel, you work in business, but you don't work in travel as such. From what you've heard today, what are your thoughts about the travel industry per se, and how it's able to tackle this and make sure that mental health is higher on the agenda?
Well, I have to say, listening to both Karen and Belinda, it's been very uplifting to me to hear the degree to which kind of mental health has been front and center of a lot of the things that you're doing, and I think that focus on a leadership culture which encourages and allows people to talk. A culture where people, leaders in the business, recognize that it's absolutely an appropriate leadership conversation to be asking, how are you doing, as well as, what's the sales, what's the metrics, what's the kind of risk, is absolutely mission critical. And then listening to both of you talk about how much you've taken on that board, I think it's fantastic, despite the very, very difficult challenges that you're all facing. So I was really pleased to hear some of those things.
Yeah. Excellent stuff. Look, we're out of time, so I'll wrap things up now. And thanks to John, thanks to Belinda, thanks Karen, and thanks Chris for joining us this morning. It has been really fascinating. It really builds on the stuff we've been doing for the past 12 months and longer. And Travel Weekly will continue this focus now more than ever, because we understand that it's probably ever more critical that we keep a focus on this area. Massive thanks to Deloitte and to John for supporting us. We'd have loved to have done it in person, and we will do again one day. I'm sure we will. So look forward to that, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.